A family experience. There are times when parents should involve their total families in worshiping God and trusting Him to meet their needs. Here now is Dr. Gene Getz.
Now, this principle really is an extension of the principle that we've just looked at in the previous section, which we call prayer and faith. But here we have an illustration of those that are involved in that, and here it relates to whole families. And we read about this in 2 Chronicles 20:13. All Judah was standing before the Lord with their infants, their wives, and their children. You can imagine that scene. And it was in this setting that there was a prophet, Jahaziel. And Jahaziel spoke up from the Lord, and he reassured the king and the people that were gathered there that they would indeed defeat their enemies. God was going to answer their prayers. So you see, not only was it the adults that were standing there, but whole families. And we read it very clearly. Infants, wives, children. And so we read in 2 Chronicles 20:18, then Jehoshaphat bowed with his face to the ground, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem fell down before the Lord to worship Him. The king was modeling this. Imagine, here are children, fathers, mothers, children. And they're looking at the king, bowing down before them. He was modeling this. Their king, their leader, was demonstrating this humility. So they saw this. But not only did they see the king, these children saw their parents, because their parents fell before the Lord and worshiped the Lord. What an incredible model this was. And as a result of this, the next day, they also saw, when I say they, I'm referring to the children and the youth, they saw victory. And they saw the relationship between the victory and prayer. The king, their parents, as they fell before the Lord. And what an incredible thing this was for these families to see this, and particularly the children. You know, it's interesting, in the New Testament we have family scenarios. I'm thinking of one scene, particularly that involved children. Paul stopped in Tyre on his way to Jerusalem. He had been warned that he was going to face a lot of trouble. But notice the family scene that is recorded by Luke in Acts chapter 21. When our days there were over, Luke is along here. He's writing, but Luke is part of the entourage as they're traveling to Jerusalem. When our days there were over, we left to continue our journey, while all of them with their wives and children. Here you have another family setting. With their wives and children, escorted us out of the city. After kneeling down on the beach to pray, we said goodbye to one another, and then we boarded the ship and they returned home. Again, we have children and youth seeing this incredible scene where they are kneeling down and praying and worshiping the Lord. And so here I think is a good practical question. What are some crisis situations where the whole family should be involved? But on the other hand, when should children be protected from traumatic events? And this takes a lot of wisdom. And let me try to illustrate this for you. On the side of protecting your children, I remember when my wife and I received an invitation to leave the Chicago area where I was teaching at Moody Bible Institute to come to Dallas Seminary to become an associate professor. And we were in the process of praying about this because basically both Elaine and I thought that probably we'd be teaching and working at Moody Bible Institute until Jesus took us home. But God had another plan, but we weren't quite sure about it, and this invitation sort of came out of the blue when Dr. Howard Hendricks called me and said, Jane, I'd like you to come to Dallas and be my associate professor. Would you consider it? Shared it with Elaine, and then we thought, well, maybe we ought to share it with our children. Well, the fact of the matter is, Renee and Robin were about maybe 8, 9 years old. Now, can you imagine an 8 and 9-year-old praying about leaving their home, their friends, and moving to Dallas? Well, we traumatized them. In fact, they didn't want to talk to God about leaving. You know, it wasn't really a good example to put them in a position where they don't even talk to God. They don't want to do it because they didn't want to leave their friends. And I remember they're saying when we asked them to pray, we don't want to leave. We don't want to leave. You know, we don't want to leave. I don't think it was very smart. That was an adult decision where we should have prayed and then said to our children, we believe God is leading us to Dallas. Oh, yes, they would say, I don't want to go. But they'd get over it a lot faster than having to be put through a prayer process where they're struggling, you know, even with their little personal theologies in terms of prayer. Wasn't very smart. I think there are times when we have to be very, very cautious about involving children in adult decisions. They're not mature enough to do that. But on the other hand, I was thinking of another illustration. This goes back to the farm in Indiana. And back there on the farm in Indiana, there were times when it would get very, very windy, and it would get very, very dark. And I'd look out the window to the west, and I'd see this black cloud moving in. Or sometimes it was in the middle of the night when my mother and dad would get us out of bed, and we'd go to the basement. And while we were in the basement, we were praying because, you know what was happening, a tornado watch. And in those days, you couldn't turn to the Weather Channel. You only went by the fact this could be a tornado. And so there in the basement, we prayed. And I'll never forget that. Now, in a sense, this was like the families in Judah. That was a good experience for us in the midst of that crisis, which my parents hadn't created, where we prayed, Lord, protect us here. And by the way, fortunately, we never did go through a tornado. They went by us, around us, but it never hit our farm. I'm just simply saying that what I'm illustrating is there, I think, is a case where you involve children. You have no choice. They need to see you pray and trust in God, and they develop a sense of security from your parents rather than a sense of anxiety created by perhaps a decision that I just illustrated earlier that wasn't very smart, wasn't very wise. So let me repeat that principle, which I think is very, very important. Growing out of the life of Jehoshaphat and Judah. There are times when parents should involve their total families in worshiping God and trusting Him to meet their needs. And of course, some of those times that are the best times are in the midst of serious crises that are beyond our control.